We don't have a broken mind, we have a broken heart.
Welcome to Commune. We are on a mission to inspire, heal, and bring the world closer together.
David Kessler, welcome back to the Commune podcast. Such a treat to be with you, my friend.
I'm always glad to be with you and everyone. It's lovely.
I know, we have our own little enclave up here in the Hollywood Hills. You're in Studio City, I'm in Laurel Canyon. We're virtually neighbors.
And we used to meet at our local Staples.
That's right.
Do you remember that? We would
did.
always run into each other at Staples.
Yes, well, that time of year is coming around again because I still have children who are in need of books and pencils and whatnot. So I recently revisited the course that we made together, Help for the Hurting Heart, and it's just a fabulous course. And it reminds me so much about how valuable your work is and how articulate you are. And of course, you've proven yourself to be the world's foremost leader on the topic of grief. And the world has a lot of use for you. Your work is right on time, particularly over the last few years. I mean, just in this country, we've seen over 1 million people die specifically of COVID, but all of the other downstream impacts and the constellation related to that, from suicide and opioid addiction and overdose, et cetera.
Fentanyl poisoning.
That's right. I mean, and this is hitting very close to home. Even with my daughters, I've seen it. And of course, then not even just related to grief, specifically in connection with death, but also many people lost their businesses and their jobs and moved into isolation because of quarantine and became increasingly lonely and disconnected. So as I say, your work is more valuable and useful than ever. But I think it would be helpful for people to learn a little bit more about you, because I've often heard you say that you didn't choose this line of work, that this vocation chose you. So maybe you could describe a little bit about how you came to be the expert that you are.
Yeah, and I just also want to just add a little to what you said. First of all, I'm honored to be one of the people that helps in the world with this topic. And, it isn't a topic that you dive into. Whenever I get criticism, I'm like, this isn't a topic anyone chooses lightly to work into. I was 13 years old. I had a mother who was in and out of hospitals. And I always just assumed that was going to be her life, in and out of hospitals. One day she got really sick. We had to go to a city a few hours away at a hotel. And I was 13. You had to be 14, couldn't visit. So I was always in the lobby, hoping a nice nurse would let me in. And one day we were over at the hotel and someone yelled fire. There was a fire, a huge evacuation. We're all outside. The fire trucks pull up. I mean, I'm a 13-year-old boy. It's a little interesting to me. And then all of a sudden, shooting starts. And it turns out it was an active shooter. Went on for 13 hours, one of the first mass shootings in the U.S. Wow. And, I saw so many people die. Hotel guests, first responders, chief of police. It was really just horrific. And, it was, how do I hold all that from, it's adventurous, it's horrific, it's all of those things. And then my mother dies alone. So the only words anyone had for me was be strong, which is kind of like, forget about you, take care of everyone else, ignore those feelings. And I really felt the trauma of it, the grief of it. I was just going to be damaged this lifetime. It was just over. I was going to be this broken individual. And I really tried to find some healing. And I went to community college, and there was 2 classes that everyone said were the easy ones. One was human sexuality. It was already full. And the other one was on death and dying. And I took the On Death and Dying one, and there was this woman I learned about, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, that like had a language for what I was feeling. And so I thought, oh, there's hope here. So that became my quest for my own healing. Eventually, went into end of life care, tried to figure out, is there a better way to do the experience I had been through? Because it was such a horrible way to say goodbye to someone. And I think we see that there are better ways to say goodbye. And so I was really honored later in life. I got to know Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. We did 2 books together. I was honored to adapt her Stages of Dying for Stages of Grief. Mm-hmm. They were so misunderstood, still are misunderstood. I always sort of half jokingly say, page 1, we say of that book on grief and grieving, they're not linear. There's no one right way to do grief. There's no model. Grief's organic, and people still are like, don't make us follow your rules. And I'm like, just read page 1. There's no rules in grief. It's very messy. It's very messy. So honored to work with her, to have her as a teacher. I also had a wonderful friend, Louise Hay. She and I did a book together called You Can Heal Your Heart. About, people were like, how do you take positive psychology and apply it to grief and loss? And I love that we were able to do that, because I think people think you're going to go, there is no death. And it's like, no, there is death. How can we approach it in a holistic, healing way? So have had this wonderful career, helping people, healing myself. I'm such a believer in helping is healing. And after decades of doing this work, have 2 sons, I get a call. My younger son, David, 21 years old, died unexpectedly. And so it's as brutal as anyone would think it is. I wanted to write a note to every parent I'd ever counseled saying, I had no idea how bad the pain was. And I once again really wondered, is this recoverable? Can I find my way through this darkness? And, in this life, we go through these horrendous things, breakups, divorce, betrayal, pet loss, all these things, and death of a loved one and death of a child. And I am so grateful that over the years, I helped and sat at the feet of people who found happiness and joy after just horrific things, that they were really my evidence that it was still possible. So I sort of, was trying to figure out how to get through that loss. And I would watch myself, I'm in denial, I'm in anger, I'm in the stages, It all seems to, I kind of thought, is everything I've taught going to be true still? And it was. But when I got to acceptance, I was like, just beginning to do the dance of I'm going to have to accept this. I went, I can't stop here. This just can't be, he's gone, I'm going to accept it. I needed more. And that turned out to be meaning. And I had studied meaning, and I wanted to figure out how to really apply it to loss, and Viktor Frankl's work on meaning. And what I came up with in my own healing was that I think the thing that people misunderstand is, if you talk about meaning, it's not in the horrible death. I mean, there's no meaning in a horrible COVID death or a horrible murder or a child dying or your pet dying. Meaning is in us, and it's what we do after the death. So what meaning could I make? And, I decided to write a book about it. And I was really honored that the Kubler-Ross family and foundation, people kept going, that's the 6th stage, allowed me to make meaning a 6th stage. So the book was Finding Meaning, the 6th stage of grief. And it was sort of my path to find healing and meaning. And, I think there's people who look at the book, and that's the one thing about the title, they'll go, Finding Meaning, I'm not there. And I'll go, the book's about excavating the pain.
Mm-hmm.
When you get rid of the pain, you find the meaning underneath it.
Yeah.
So that's sort of how I came to all of this.
Yeah. So interesting, David. There's so much there that I want to pull at. I mean, my grandfather, who I just absolutely cherished, he lost his daughter when she was in her late 20s. She was on, she lived in Chicago, and she was on a bicycle with her little infant on the back. And the circumstances are somewhat mysterious, but she fell and hit her head. And the baby, Terry, was put on the evening news. And a friend of my grandfather's called him and said, "Arthur, pick up the phone or put the TV on. I think Terry's on the news." And that's how he found out that his daughter had died. And like you said, our culture seems to underwrite this kind of notion of, well, you just have to move on, kind of like buck up, be strong, move on. And, he was of, the great generation or whatever, this generation of very kind of strong men who didn't necessarily outwardly show a lot of emotion. And, it was really hard for him. I mean, I witnessed how difficult, how much pain that he went through. But like you said, on the other side, what he found was meaning in family. And he spent the rest of his life making it so easy for all the other grandkids and nephews and nieces and cousins to come visit. He bought an apartment that was way too big for just himself and my grandmother, just to be able to assemble people. And we called him Mr. Possible, because he made all of our lives possible. And, he found that post-traumatic growth in the pain. I mean, I think of the great Dostoevsky quote, which Viktor Frankl says, he's like, his great fear is, am I worthy of my suffering? And of course, there are wonderful examples out there. I think the woman that started Mothers Against Drunk Driving, right?
But here's the thing. Post-traumatic growth occurs more than post-traumatic stress. But we talk more about post-traumatic stress. Mm. And we also, amazing story that you have, but we also know someone, their spouse died and they don't leave the house anymore.
Right.
Their parent died and they never seem to individuate themselves. And so many people that it ends up destroying their world.
Yeah.
And they can't find life after loss. And we mentioned the pandemic, and I had a moment that I think illustrates this really well. Really early on in the pandemic, friend comes over, walking 6 feet apart on the street, and we're talking. A young woman walks up and burst into tears, and she says, "I'm one of your neighbors. I heard you do something about grief." And I said, "Yes," and I explained. And she said, "My wedding's been postponed." And she was just heartbroken. And I talked to her. We talked for a few minutes. My friend sort of listened. And then afterwards, she said, "Thank you," after we chatted, and she left. And I said, "We could talk again." And my friend said, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe you were so patient with her. Here, your son died. That's real grief. She's going to have her wedding in another 3 months. Now we know it would have been probably another year or two, but she's going to have a wedding." And he goes, "That's not grief." And I said, "It actually is." You don't understand. One of the things is grief is a word for so many losses.
Yeah.
And she did have a real loss. And here's the thing. For her at 20, that actually was the worst grief she had ever been through. It was the worst loss. And I always tell people are like, which is the worst loss? Is it your pet that's there 24 hours a day for 17 years? Is it your child? Is it your husband, your wife of 40 years? And I always go, the worst loss is yours.
Yeah.
It's yours.
There's a subjectivity to it.
And if we go into our brain to compare, we get out of our heart. We don't have a broken mind. We have a broken heart. Comparing never helps with healing.
Yeah. Yeah. You underscore that both in your book and in the course. And I think it is really helpful for people to not be ashamed of their own guilt or of their own grief.
Or guilt, for that matter.
Or
absolutely. Because guilt's a big companion with grief.
Yeah.
But I think, and we do, just like you say, we have a world that sometimes if you're in grief a little too long for others, it can make them uncomfortable. And we want you to move on, and we want you to get over it because we want you to be happy. But sometimes also this grief is making us uncomfortable.
That's right. And, one thing that you speak about so eloquently is that, and as it pertains to this woman that you and your friend ran into, is that it seems as if she wanted her grief to be witnessed, to be seen.
Of course.
Can you talk about how important that is for healing?
Yeah, we're not meant to be islands of grief. Studies over and over in grief and trauma show that we need each other to heal. We need community. I mean, if you think about it, people are like, oh, it's been shown in studies, but like, have we ever heard, someone isolated for 20 years, it really healed them? I mean, we kind of intuitively know isolation is not a healing thing to do. I mean, it's actually considered the worst torture that you can do to someone.
Yeah, so next to the death penalty, right?
Next to the death, right, penalty. So we need others, and we need them to witness our grief, to see our pain, to see what we're going through. Whatever it is, whether it's your pet, your spouse, your child, your job loss, all those things. And I got to tell you, I'm going to say something so politically incorrect in the grief world. It's so bizarre to even say this. Mm-hmm. I miss my son every day. It's just, I can't tell you the level of heartbreak I live with around that. And I've still found joy, and I've still found happiness in his honor. And decades ago, I was fired from a job, and it was traumatic for me. To this day, I have nightmares about being fired. Now, logically, I would have said, once your child dies, that's going to be your only nightmare. And I wake up from the nightmare about the job, and I'm like, I can't believe my mind is still revolving around that. These other losses are traumatic.
Yeah.
And so, when I always talk about all grief does not have trauma, but all trauma has grief.
Yeah.
And so, people will often say, because after my son died, my dog of 17 years died, and, then another family member, and they're like, oh my gosh, which was the worst? And I'm like, why do I have to choose? Yeah. They were all horrible.
Yeah, the comparison is futile. But I think in terms of the firing, for example, that was an assault on your own self-worth.
Right. And my identity.
And your identity.
And traumatic and broadsided and all those things.
Yeah.
So that's still, I'm like, really? That's still around?
No,
okay.
It's curious. I know. I think, one of the things that you point out around ongoing grief is related to our tendency to anchor our perception of ourselves in our own personal folklore, if you will. We continue to tell ourselves stories about ourselves that then prop up a certain kind of identity that we want to display to the world, or that we feel most comfortable with. And you have an exercise that I find to be really, really helpful to kind of untangle the story from the actual fact, from the event itself. And we could play this out together a little bit, but I know that you've given some examples in the past of
Sure, I could do that.
Of like a young daughter whose father leaves and doesn't wave goodbye, at the end, and as a culmination.
Yeah, let me
of a
tell that
divorce.
just so they have a context.
Yeah.
So we're story-making machines. Some stories we get before we can even realize that we're story-making machines. There's a young girl whose parents are divorcing. She's following her dad around the house as he's moving out. She kind of wishes, that he just, why him? Why does he have to go? She loves her dad. He's packed up. He's in the station wagon, got everything packed up, and she's standing there like at 5 years old. He's getting ready to drive away. And she's recounting this story decades later as a grown woman. And she says, do you know how in all those books and movies, the dad turns around as he drives away and goes, don't you worry, honey, Daddy's coming back for you. She said he just drove away. Just drove away, no look back. She then internalizes that without any adults around to go, oh my goodness, honey, that's not about you. She internalizes that. I'm not worth a look back. I'm not worthy. I'm not enough that someone will stay for. Decades later, when she's dealing with a divorce, what comes up? Well, no wonder everyone leaves. I'm not worth staying with. And all those old things come up. So it turns out that there's the event that happened, and then there's the story, and then there's our belief system that comes out of it. Right? So we all live with those things. The exercise, and I adapted it from a friend of mine, Neil Strauss's work. It goes like this, and it's about noticing. I'll just do it.
Yeah.
So you want to do it with me, or should I?
Well,
all right.
we can
We can do it. Here we go. So the exercise is this. We're going to name 3 events, major events, positive and negative. So at least one positive, however, it can be a mixture. And we're going to say them, just the facts. No details, no emotions, just the facts. I'll give you the example. If I was going to do my life, I would say, just the facts. My mother died when I was 13. My first book came out in 1995. My son died 6 years ago. That's the facts.
The unadulterated facts.
Unadulterated facts.
No,
you want to go ahead?
No bias.
No bias,
judgment,
no anything.
No valence.
Just the facts.
Sure. So I'll give you 3. I had cancer when I was 13. I was in a cancer hospital. Shortly thereafter, my parents got divorced. And in 1995, I married my childhood sweetheart.
Great. So now we're going to go back to those same 3 events, and we're going to do them with the worst possible scenario. All of them.
Okay.
So I'll do mine first. A little more details. My mother died when I was 13. I wasn't ready to be in the world without her. I really still needed a mother. My book came out in 1995. I didn't think I was going to be criticized. I didn't think through that anyone could just criticize me or the book, and it didn't even have to be based in truth. I wasn't ready for that. My son died 6 years ago. Brutal then, brutal now. Still miss him. Okay? Now, your three things don't change, exactly
Right,
the same ones.
So I was in Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in 1983. I had a roommate with terminal leukemia. I was in the pediatrics ward. I was incredibly scared and shocked and not ready to emotionally process what was going on around me, even though my case was not that bad. My parents got divorced not that much later.
By the way, in this real exercise, I would stop you from adding my case was not that bad.
Oh, yeah, you're right.
In this scenario,
in this
it's
case,
horrible.
You're right. That's
okay?
fair. Right. My parents got divorced. My mother left. I thought I could save the marriage because I thought it was about me on some level, but I couldn't. And in 1995, when I was 24, I married Skylar. And I was really scared then too, because I'm not sure I was ready to live up to my side of the bargain. I didn't know if I was emotionally equipped to really be a partner.
Okay. Now we're going to do the same three events again. Here's the thing. The events never change.
Yeah.
The events never change. So let's do them again with the most positive aspect.
Okay.
Even the worst ones. Okay. My mother died when I was 13. Wasn't ready for that. Wasn't ready to be in the world alone. And it changed my life and the trajectory. And it's given me this amazing career to help people. And I think it would be so meaningful to her that out of that horrific situation in my childhood, I've gotten to touch and witness and be with so many other people and help them. In 1995, my book came out. Once an author, always an author. It's a pretty great platform. Pretty great platform to have. I'm really grateful for it. 6 years ago, my son David died. Brutal then, brutal now. And you know what? It's deepened my work. I've gone places with people I couldn't have gone before. I've found a deeper commitment to this work that he would be really proud that his death didn't constrict my work, but was expanded in his honor.
Beautiful.
Your
Okay.
turn, the positive ones. Same three, they don't change.
Okay. I had cancer when I was 13. I was Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. And I got my surgery and my treatment, and I was okay. And let's just say that place has a smaller outdoor than it does an indoor. So I was grateful that I was okay. But mostly, I think I went in as a boy and came out as a man in some ways.
Wow.
I learned about compassion and the identification of other people's suffering as my own. I've never done this exercise. Okay. So, in the wake of my parents' divorce, and my estrangement from my mother, I really did need to learn how to love myself and not necessarily count fully on others to do that, but to in some ways fulfill my own needs. And that when my cup was full, I learned that it was easier to give, that love could transmute from something taken to something given. It was a long journey, though. I married Skylar, and while I was afraid that I wasn't equipped to be a good partner, I worked my way into it, and I became, I think, a very strong and devoted partner. But also, I learned that I was worthy of someone else's love.
Okay. So you did good in the exercise.
Thanks.
So here's the thing. You know, when I do this exercise, I do it in the course, I do it in groups, do it online in my grief group, and do it with people I teach how to be grief educators. We do this. And I always ask, what do you think that was about what we did? And people will say, it was about meaning making, or it was about post-traumatic growth, or it was about seeing there's two sides to every story, or it's about understanding the event versus the story. And I always say all those things are true, but mainly I hope it's about you beginning to have awareness. There's a way you tell your story.
Yeah.
There's a way we all tell our story. And by the way, it changes. Remember, I said my story when I was young, my story was, I'm a victim, I'm damaged, life is over. Then it's, and I can even remember before that being really young and feeling like, oh, everyone's got bad things, we're all just the same. And people were like, no, we don't all have shootings in our childhood. And then at some point, I thought I told this story as a survivor. I was a survivor. And then later on, it became more of the hero's journey, And so to realize there's these events, and then there's how we tell our stories around them. And to realize there's a lot of variations.
Yeah.
And we get to choose which we live in.
Yeah, it's funny. Thinking about this, I wrote this quote down from, he's a Stoic philosopher, Epictetus. He said this a couple of thousand years ago.
I know where it's going. It's a great quote. Keep going.
Yeah.
Read it out.
It is not events that disturb people. It is their judgments concerning them. Yeah. And there's many more quotes from Stoicism.
But I think that's sort of
topic.
One of the original ones, I think. I mean, we've all heard a million variations of that. But it's how, not what happened to us, but how we process it. Because we all do know the person that never comes out of their house. And we also see the sports figure or the actor who's getting an award and dedicating it to their mom who died and got them through that traumatic childhood.
Yeah, I mean, we often say about people and about ourselves, oh, well, they'll never change. But if life has one thing that's true, it's that it's always changing all the time. Of course, the Buddha made that observation a long time ago. But, even in the most prosaic example, I used to hate the Lakers growing up because I grew up on the East Coast. Now, okay, the Lakers, they're my hometown team. I've changed my belief structure about something as silly as being a sports fan. But that's just an indication that we are changing our beliefs and thought systems all of the time. And that we are capable of changing. And a lot of that, as you say, is moored in these stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves that then prop up a certain version of ourselves.
And this is going to sound strange to say, but one of the most inspiring places and sad places that I can go to is my social media. Any day you look on my Facebook or Instagram or Threads now.
Threads.
You can find me as I am David Kessler. That was the only version of my name I could get. But there's some quote I'm putting up and there's someone writing in the comment, you don't understand, I can't heal.
Yeah.
I can't heal. It's not possible. And I think of, Henry Ford had a quote, whether you think you can or you think you can't, you're right.
Right.
And we have two things that are important to know. learned helplessness, where we really get locked into there is no healing. And the other is learned optimism, that we can learn past that. We can grow past that. And in the course, I really go through like the learned helplessness and all that to help people understand there's trauma that is the reason we are not hopeful. There's a reason when someone says, I can't ever heal. And by the way, people sometimes go, don't even like the word healing. I go, you have a story that healing means forgetting. Healing to me just means the loss no longer controls me. Mm-hmm. I get to purely love my son without it controlling me. Mm-hmm. And that we need each other to be evidence of healing. That's why I have this huge online grief group that people are in. And we find ourselves in each other's stories.
Yeah.
You see, in Tender Hearts, I saw this person not be able to get through a sentence without crying and saying they're never going to make it. And then here they are, and they're doing better. And I'm a witness to that. So if it's true for them, it might be true for me.
Mm-hmm. And maybe you could break apart the experience of grief and trauma. What is the difference between grief and trauma?
So I think of grief as a few things. Obviously, we think of grief as the pain. We think of, or I remind people, we don't always think of this as grief as the love.
Right.
And grief is also a change you didn't want. The divorce, the breakup, the job loss, the death, the pet loss, it's a change you didn't want. And there is a pureness to the grief. If I'm in my pure grief, I would tell you, there's times I miss my son. There's times I've been angry about my son dying. There's times I just love him and just miss him so much. That's the pure grief. Trauma is, there's some hints to trauma for me that I always think of old wounds. Always, never, everyone, no one, those extremes. My son has died, I'm always going to be in pain. I'm never going to be able to survive. There's no one there for me. Everyone doesn't care about my grief. Those are often signs of trauma we've been through. And when we have the grief, we don't get to go to the pure grief and work with it because the trauma gets projected onto it. Mm-hmm. My son abandoned me. My son left me. Or I'm rejected, whatever it may be, that old trauma playing out. And it's fascinating. We all do this. Like we date the wrong people. We're attracted to the wrong things we think in our mind. And we sort of think, of course, that trauma is going to not happen around grief. And it does. Like I remember someone in my group sharing that her core wound was being rejected. And she talked about her husband's death was such a rejection of her. And then she told the story of how her life's horrible. There's a place near her that's got outdoor concerts. And she went to the concert early. And there was a row of seats that said, reserved. And she sat down in one of them. And the security person came up and said, "Oh, are you part of this?" She goes, "No, I just want to sit here." And he tells her she can't. And she goes, "I'm rejected everywhere in my grief." And like I said to her, "Were there other empty rows?" And she goes, "Oh yeah, there were 100 other empty rows." And in my mind, I'm like, why would you, you're creating this rejection.
Right. Yeah.
And we often look back at that trauma and go, why am I attracted to the wrong people? Why am I doing this? And I'm so screwed up and I'm so damaged. And why do I keep doing all these things that sort of re-traumatize me? And I go, it's actually the opposite. That's coming up for your healing. It's like an old friend knocking at your door going, don't forget about me. I want to be healed. And I'm trying to use the word activated instead of triggered these days. But, sometimes when people would come to me and go, I don't even know what to do with my grief. I don't know even how to tell you about it to figure it out. I'll go, where are your triggers? Where are you activated? Because those are the places where the pain and trauma lives. And that's where the healing resides. These things that we resist are like a map to our healing. And, I think we have to sort of live with the reality of what we run from pursues us and what we face transforms us. And that's very true in grief and trauma.
To what degree does one's ability to access the present moment help with one's ability to recover from loss?
You have to get in the present moment. And boy, trauma will keep you in the past.
Yeah.
There's a story I share of a woman who talked about how every day in her grief, every day, she pictures her husband dying. And I said, what happened? And she said, we were on this road trip, Route 66, going across the country. We're retired. We got off the main path. We went on an old highway. There was no one on it. My husband wanted to take pictures at the giant cactuses we saw in the desert. He crossed the deserted highway to take pictures of me. He had to get further and further to get it. He didn't have now we have new phones that you could have widened it out. But he had to really walk back. And she said he got a lot of pictures and then he started to walk towards her. And he stopped at the highway and he was looking, scanning the pictures. Did he get it? And there was a car coming and she thought he stopped and she thought he saw the car. And he was looking at the phone and walked right in front of the car. And she said to me, every day I watch him get hit. And I remember thinking, it's horrific enough that he died once, but now he dies every day. And so she's stuck in that day. She's stuck in that day. And the work in grief and trauma is to move her from that day into the present moment. And that takes work and that takes people showing up that, a lot of trauma work is around grounding that person in come here in the now, breathe into the now, look at 5 things, you're here in the now. And to get her into the present moment and say, that moment is over. You're not seeing your husband get hit by a car anymore. Look around this room. He's not getting hit by a car. Come into the present moment. Yeah. What some people, I think, who don't fully do this work forget is you can't leave her husband in that moment. That keeps us stuck if he's still in that moment. So the work is to bring her into the present moment and bring her husband. So I might say, where's your husband now? You're in the present moment. Where is he? Where's his body? Let's start there. Did he get buried? Did he get cremated? He got buried. Oh my gosh, he's 6 feet under now. Safe, can never get hit by a car. He's cremated. He's on your shelf at home. He's scattered at sea. He's safe. He can never get hit by a car again. Or do you believe in the afterlife? He's in heaven. He's safely there. So we try to move both people out of that traumatic moment. And we often forget about the idea of traumatic grief. There's grief, there's trauma, and there's traumatic grief. And traumatic grief is really 2 things. How someone died is traumatic, like seeing him get hit by a car, or we experience it as traumatic because of our childhood. Like so many times a parent dies, there's 4 siblings. 3 siblings experience the death as meaningful. 1 sibling experiences as traumatic.
Mm-hmm.
We actually sort of define our own trauma. No one gets to tell us what our trauma is or what our healing would look like.
Mm.
That was a lot, but I wanted to sort of
Yeah.
unpack all of that.
Yeah, it's helpful. I mean, in every experience of the past, what we call a memory, happens in the present. So,
But that is the difference between post-traumatic stress, is that if I remember what happened, I am remembering. Post-traumatic stress as I am re-feeling it.
right. Yes. It's that you are re-triggering your emotional response.
And you're
in
back
the moment.
in that moment.
Right.
And you leave the present moment.
But I think that just even acknowledging that cognitively, and this is why the work is very, very hard, because sometimes it starts in your head, has to migrate to your heart. Or
And
to
you
the
got to do
feeling.
this with other
Yeah,
people.
right.
That's why you really need other people.
But but for example, like we were just briefly talking about some of my trauma. I would say an event that induced trauma, what Peter Levine famously calls the tyranny of the past. So, where I was locked in a locker, and I think it was in 7th grade or something, and I relive my emotional response to that particular event.
Can we just stop for just a moment? I'm so sorry that happened. How hideous. I mean, just the idea of this 7-year-old being locked in a locker. I mean, just, to like take that in there. Because it's easy to, like going to our storytelling, it's
true.
easy to just sort of go, oh, and the story is da-da-da-da-da-da, and, to go, wait a minute.
When I think about it, it's like boys have a strange way of showing affection to for one another. And this is a stranger artifact of culture. But my friends who did this to me, they were my friends, and we were like playing around at school. It was in 7th grade. So I was like, whatever that was, 10, 12 or something. And so it was actually a reflection of some sort of like playful boyhood friendliness, but
for them. But it was trauma for you.
For me. And even though I have 101 tools to process these kinds of things, given what I do for a living, and now that I'm 52, I still relive that emotional response to that trauma. And oftentimes, not only will I live in the past, but I will take that and project it into the future as some kind of negative anticipatory memory that I'm making, even though nothing's happened yet.
Of that. Like what?
Okay, so like I have a plane trip coming up, or I have a meeting that I know that's going to happen in a small office, or anything that might have a sort of claustrophobic element to it where I am out of control. And I will become anxious and worried about an event that hasn't even happened yet, or may not even happen, because I am taking an event of the past and projecting it into the future. And I think many of us live with that kind of anxiety, and then I become anxious about the potential feeling of the anxiety. It's not even anything to do with the event itself. And then I'm walking around activated in this anxious state because, oh my God, next week I might have to do that thing, and I might get triggered, I might get activated to feel that sense of panic that I had when I was in 7th grade. And
do you want some feedback on this?
Please.
So
yeah.
one of the things is there was claustrophobia, but there was also a loss of control.
Right.
So, with people like this, sometimes it's to really understand, number one, you can say no to that meeting. Number two, you could change the location of that meeting, probably. You have a choice of whether you get on that plane or not. You also can get on that plane really early to sort of make peace with, this is safe. And one of the tools I love is to go, that was then, this is now.
Mm.
I was locked in. I didn't have tools to get out. I didn't know my friends were safely going to let me out. I'm now in a plane that is a very safe mode of transportation, safer than the car. And we are going to get out. And I have a lot of choice here. I made sure I choose my seat and all those things to realize the control you have in that now that you didn't have then.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny. I didn't know we were going to go in this direction, but one of the quotes.
It's Jeff therapy today.
Yeah, I know. One of the quotes that I actually wrote down, it was he's an American theologian, Reinhold Niebuhr, but he was also a Stoic. He was very influenced by Stoicism. Of course, he wrote, the Serenity Prayer has been attributed to many, many different people, but his, and I'll just read it so I get it right. God grant me the serenity to accept the things that I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. So I think part of your teaching is what you just articulated, is focus on the areas over which you have control. And that can be a powerful tool for you.
And to know there's an inner wisdom in you that is actually trying to heal you. And that plane, that meeting, is actually not being done to you. It's being done for you, for your healing. It's an opportunity to go back. And it's the closest thing we actually have to time travel. You get to go back to that boy in 7th grade and help him find control and remember you have control now. And so that's the thing, when we begin to not look at these triggers and activators as horrible things, but our friends. And as much as I have tried, like everyone else, to not get activated or triggered, if you're alive, it's going to happen, and it's for you, and to allow it, especially in grief and trauma.
Yeah.
But you need the tools,
right,
and you need people.
I think just the ability to talk about it, honestly.
Yeah.
I mean, and of course, we're very illiterate in our culture in terms of being able to manage and process grief and pain. And like we said before, we often get the messages of you just got to buck up and, don't show your emotions and don't be vulnerable. You'll be all right, but we know this is not a profitable
And
approach.
we live with this grief the grief and trauma running our lives. It's this misery in the background that we've suppressed.
Yeah.
It's running our lives. Our relationships are created out of it. Our decisions are created out of it. And we leave it unattended.
So let's talk about relationships, because you define grief as pain associated with the
Right.
loss of connection, really. Now, that could be connection to a loved one because they've passed,
Right.
but it also can be related to a relationship that ends
Romantic,
in
sure.
divorce or estrangement, etc. So what are some useful tools that one can leverage as they manage that pain associated with the disintegration of a relationship?
So I think about everything as a death.
Mm.
A breakup is the death of that relationship. A divorce is the death of that marriage. A job loss is the death of that paycheck in that place with those people. And so we do need to grieve it. The old wounds are going to come onto it. And I think, there's a lot of challenges with that. I've heard people say, I've had a loved one who died. I mean, I think someone said once that like they had a husband who died and they were very much over the years at peace with that. And they found healing. And they said now they're being divorced. And they said it was so different that like there's not someone gone peacefully. There's someone alive in the world rejecting you every single day. And how hard that was for them. And I think the other thing that I see, and this is part of those beliefs we're raised with, is so many times, I talk about pain from loss is inevitable, suffering is optional. Of course, there's horrific pain. I loved being with this person. They're leaving me. I want more of them. That's not possible. That's the pain. That's the grief you have to do. Suffering is when your mind says, and they were your soulmate. So the one soulmate you get on this planet left you. That's going to cause some deep suffering.
Yeah.
And it's those beliefs we're ingrained with. And I always, when I work with people, I go, by the way, I have a different story about our soulmates. I believe our soulmates are the ones that stay. I actually don't think our soulmates are the ones that leave. I think when they leave us, that's a sure sign they weren't our soulmate. But think about what a horrible situation you're in, that you had one soulmate, gone. We might have more than one, and they might have not been the one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What role does forgiveness play in that process of healing from a broken relationship?
Forgiveness is a lot like boundary work. We always think boundary work is about the other person, and it's really about us. And it's the same with forgiveness. We think forgiveness is about the other person, apologizing or doing it differently or whatever it may be. And forgiveness is work inside of us. It's a lot of work inside of us. And we have this theory, like people will say to me, I tried forgiveness, it didn't work. And I'll go, okay, what'd you do? And they'll go, well, I tried it. And I'll go, just, can you tell me your process? And it'll basically come down to, well, I had a thought, I want to forgive them, and magic didn't happen.
Yeah.
I think it takes I start with usually a 30-day practice. And there's a lot of different ways to approach forgiveness. Can you see that person as an innocent baby?
Mm-hmm.
Can you also understand that they were probably taught to behave, and wounded people wound people? Someone wounded them, they wounded you. Another thing is, can we forgive their actions or not forgive their actions, but maybe forgive the person? The person might be forgivable, but that action wasn't.
Right.
And the other thing is, we have to acknowledge our own imperfection. When I get into, I don't know if I'm forgiving them, I can get really righteous. Like, Jeff, we all make mistakes, but I would have never done what they did. And, to remember, yeah, I didn't do that, but I've done some other things. I've missed the mark. We're all kind of imperfect here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, forgiveness, there's a lot of tropes or axioms around it. Forgiveness is a gift that you give yourself, not that you give someone else. Or, you can forgive someone and still hold them accountable to the action, let's say. Or forgiveness is kind of a one man or one woman show. You don't need their participation.
Alive or dead.
Right. It's not reconciliation. It's forgiveness. So that provides a good deal of agency. You don't need them to do it. But
by the way, it's important to realize they're probably not going to be a good participant in that anyway, because if they were a good participant, they probably wouldn't have done what they did.
That's right.
And sometimes we get stuck in, they shouldn't have done it in the first place. And then I really have to go, unless you got a time machine, they did do it. Right. And we have to have acceptance that they did it. So let's start there. That's
right. I interviewed many years ago a gentleman named Robert Enright, who is one of the world's leading thought leaders around forgiveness. And I remember something that he said. I was thinking about it this morning as I was contemplating grief. I wanted to ask you about it because I found there was a similarity there. And he said, there's two types of forgiveness, and one generally precedes the other. And I said, okay, well, what do you mean by that? He's like, forgiveness usually starts in the mind and then migrates to the heart. So you have to understand some of the things that I just said, like forgiveness is actually a gift that you give yourself, and you cognitively get your head around that. But then to actually truly feel forgiveness, to release that ember that you're holding in your hand, just waiting for the right moment to throw it or whatever, that resentment that you build up, to really release that is something that needs to be felt. And I think this is the amazing thing about your work, David, is that you're able to use words and writing and courses as vessels for emotions and feelings, things that really are a product of one's direct experience, to help people cognitively understand such that then they can sort of somatically embody it. And so I wonder, I'll get to the point here, or the question is grief like forgiveness in that it starts in the mind, but then moves into the body?
It's a great question. And I actually don't know where it starts, but I know it's in all three. Mm-hmm. I know it's in our mind. I know it's in our body. I know it's in our heart. Mm-hmm. So I think we have to address it in all the different places. Even in this course, we have Paul Denniston doing grief yoga, who, like, whenever I would do a retreat, I would have him there because grief is in our body, and he talks about how our emotions get stuck there and our emotions need motion. So it's really important that we address it in all those areas. But to answer your question, I don't know exactly where it starts, but I know we got it and we need to work on it in all those places. Yeah. But there certainly is a awareness in our mind that we have to integrate into our soul. Mm. And we need to allow time for that. Mm-hmm. I mean, we get a concept, but we need to get it into our soul, and that takes time.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned my grandfather before, and when he passed, I really grieved. I mean, he was older, I think he was almost 90. So it wasn't like a disruption of the chronological order of things like the way it was with his daughter or with your son, which seems like, whoa, shocking, really shocking. He was older. He had lived a full life. But when he passed, I was really upset. But over time, I was able to reestablish the connection with him that I had lost, even though he wasn't obviously physically here in the room with me anymore. But in the same way, it's funny that you said that your son would be proud that his death didn't impair your work, that in some ways it actually fueled you with even greater sense of purpose to help others. Well, in many ways, I almost judge myself through my grandfather's eyes. I respected him so much. He lived so in alignment with his principles that when I go to that place, sometimes where I say, man, my grandfather, he would really look down right now and be proud of what I did right there. I reestablish this sense of connection with him that really assuages the grief that I've always felt losing him.
Well, to me, the goal is eventually to remember with more love than pain.
Yeah.
But we got to do it in our own time, in our own way. The other thing that's interesting is there was a time in psychology that it was thought we needed to find closure and sever that relationship. And there were even people who would say, let's write a letter and say goodbye, which now looking back is kind of ridiculous because death is such a forced goodbye. Do we really need a letter? It's in our face.
Yeah.
And luckily, psychology didn't stay there long. And it realized we have what we call continuing bonds with those who have died. And that's healthy and normal. And that's so lovely that he remains a presence in your life.
Yeah.
And as long as we remember them, they don't fully die.
That's right. That's right. So for people right now who are experiencing grief for myriad
all kinds of reasons
origins and provenances, what's the first step? I mean, what would you tell someone who's listening or to this or watching this, you're grieving, I see you, and here's where you start?
You have to be seen. You have to find some community. You got to get some tools. Grief is something we all kind of think we should know how to do. And people are surprised, even I have a certificate program, and even therapists are oh, there's these tools? And I'm yes, there's tools and techniques and concepts. But we all sort of go, oh, I think it's just inherent that we would know about grief. So you got to understand it. You got to learn about it. And I think you got to find community. And I think one of the things that really makes us stuck in so many ways is we have our spouse that gets everything. We have our best friend that really gets us. We have our loved one that gets us. And then we're in grief, and that person who should get us the most doesn't. And they are sometimes the people who are closest to us are the ones telling us to move on and get over it and don't address it. And grief is a strange place. Grief is the one place where family members and friends can become strangers, and strangers can become family members and friends. That's why
Interesting. Yeah.
you want to find groups and find people. And if your best friend doesn't get it, you've got to be a GPS and recalculate. My best friend's not getting it. Okay, let me go find some support for people who have had a brother die, a pet die, a spouse die, a parent die, a child die, partner die, whatever it is, get some support for it. But just start with understanding it is so important.
Yeah, I think in the course, there's a cohort of people that you call practical grievers.
Right.
Right. And I think we all know some of them.
Who are just move on, get it over. You go to the funeral, you cry, and you're done.
Yeah.
That's it. Don't need courses, don't need groups, you just move on. And that's how they grieve. And there's nothing wrong with them, and there's nothing wrong with us. But we think they don't feel enough, and they think we feel too much. They're just two different styles.
So, David, where can people access your work and keep abreast of everything that you're doing in the world?
Sure. Your course is a lovely place to start. I'm thrilled we're doing that again. And grief.com is my website. I have a program called Tender Hearts. It's you can find it at tenderheartsplural.support.com. And it's a large grief group. Like when people hear a grief group, they think 6 people online at a table. It's not like that. It's hundreds. And you can speak up and be in front, or you can sit back and watch. And it's magical that we find our healing in each other. You can also go to griefeducator.com is the certificate program for people who want to turn their pain into purpose or really take a deeper dive into how to help people after they've experienced grief themselves.
So last question is a little more of a personal probe.
Okay.
We were talking earlier about what an exhausting, devastating life it would be to like run for office and be a political figure. We were talking about that, and you did it.
I did it.
You did it in Los Angeles, and we've had mutual friends that have done it and are currently doing it. And we were like, oh God, that life just seems just so exhausting. When I look at your life though,
right.
and I imagine the amount of energy and weight that you have to carry for other people, I also wonder that about you. I mean, how do you manage? How do you carry so many other people's grief, or does it light you up and energize you?
Well, first of all, anyone who runs for office, bless them. It's the hardest thing in the world to do. We have friends who are doing it, and just to try to make the world a better place is an amazing thing to do with a high cost personally. Yeah. When I would do, and I'm not doing them that much anymore, in our physical world, big talks. And we would rent out a meeting room of a hotel, and we'd have, 300 people in there. And in the next meeting room of the hotel, they would have the nurses. And then the next one was the realtors. And the next one is the accountants. And at the end of the day, everyone had left. Staff would be cleaning up. And more than once, staff would go, "What were you teaching?" And I would go, "Why are you asking?" And they would go, "Because your group was laughing the most." Mm-hmm. And I would go, "Grief." And they would go, "Grief? What kind of grief?" And I would go, "That kind of grief." And here's the thing. I think when you've gone through enormous pain and trauma, it does stretches your bandwidth for pain. But I also believe it stretches your bandwidth for joy. People in that room are happier. Their laughs are more from their guts. They are fuller people with pain and with joy. So, for me personally, I'm pretty committed to fun. Yeah. Like in my off time, it's fun. I mean, nothing more fun than a hose and my dog Lucy, who's a chocolate lab, and everyone gets wet and has a great time. I mean, I'm committed to fun, and I think my life isn't as heavy as people would think. Mm-hmm. And it's also really good lessons and boundaries that I do work with a lot of people in extreme pain, but it's theirs. It's not mine. I got to give them the dignity of their own pain and never steal it from them. It doesn't belong to me. So that's how I how you do it. Keep myself whole in all of this.
Well, as you remind us, our grief is a reflection of our capacity to love.
To love, yep.
And, there's one way to avoid grief, and that's never to love. And who wants that kind of life?
I don't want to go on the journey without it. I don't want to do it,
So, really so grateful for your friendship and for your collaboration and for your work in the world. You're just such a joy to be with. Thank you, David.
Right back at you. Thank you.
All right.
Hey, thanks for watching. If you like this interview from the Commune podcast, then click subscribe and check out this video right here.